Avis, cette capsule a été produite simultanément en français et en anglais. Notice, this episode was produced simultaneously in English and French. Vous écoutez présentement la version anglaise. You are currently watching the English version.
Hello and welcome to Stereotypic STeist. I'm your host, Guy from the other day. While the heat wave continues, at least in the northern hemisphere, we're going to stay a little cooler and talk about a truly old school hack and slash dungeon crawler, Gauntlet II from Atari, released in 1986 in its arcade version, then in 1988 in its SD conversion. Gauntlet II is essentially a remake of Gauntlet, released the previous year, so it's fitting that I should say a few words about the latter.
In fact, I should start by talking about Dandy, a dungeon crawler released in 1983 for the Atari 400 and 800 XE/XL computers, in which you have to play as up to 4 characters who must navigate labyrinths, kill monsters, collect items, and find the exit to the next level. We could also include among the predecessors that inspired Gauntlet the game Time Bandit, released in 1983 for the TRS-80 color computer and adapted a few years later for the Atari ST and Amiga, in which you have to navigate labyrinths, collect items, kill monsters, and find the exit. Taking things a step further, we could also consider Konami's Tutankhamun, released in 1982 in its arcade version, in which you have to navigate labyrinths, collect items, kill monsters, and find, you guessed it, the exit.
I could still push backwards, but I'll stick to scrolling games so as not to spread myself too thin.
Thus, Gauntlet borrows a number of ideas from previous games. The goal is essentially to explore labyrinths, collect items, kill monsters, and, wait for it, find your way out. What made it appealing in its arcade version was the possibility of playing up to 4 characters at the same time in collaboration. Let's face it though, the cabinet was a money gobbler. The vitality or energy or health of the characters, so to speak, depended on the number of coins injected into the cabinet, and the owner of the arcade could determine the value in life points granted by each of these coins, as well as the difficulty level of the game.
As long as the cabinet was profitable, it was a classic, a cult game. But what about Gauntlet II?
Before digging into the ST adaptation, I'll take a moment to explain what the arcade version consists of and, in the same breath, explain some similarities and differences with its predecessor, Gauntlet. Once again, it's a dungeon crawler that can be played by up to 4 players at the same time. In principle, players can embody as many as 4 different characters: a warrior, a wizard, a Valkyrie, or an elf.
Yep. Races and classes are one and the same. Being an elf is a profession.
But unlike Gauntlet, the first of the series, each player can choose to play or embody the same character. This means you can have up to 4 magicians, differentiated by their color. There are also a few distinctions between characters, notably in terms of strength, speed of movement, and firepower or shooting speed. Usually, an advantage in one aspect is a disadvantage in another.
As in many games, there is no best character, but for my part, I prefer the Valkyrie.
Items to be collected include keys and potions. Keys are used to open gates or doors, let's say, as well as treasure chests, which may hide a monster. You can have as many keys as there's room in your inventory, but usually for each level there are at least as many keys scattered around as there are gates to open, so no real need to stock up. Potions, the plain blue ones notably, can be used to make all or at least most of the enemies on the screen disappear in one fell swoop.
Not all potions are good though.
In addition, there are other magic objects scattered throughout the labyrinth, whose effect is either limited in time or limited to the current level. One example is the ricochet shot, which isn't really very useful. At least I didn't find it that useful. Repulsiveness, on the other hand, is very convenient for keeping enemies at bay for a limited time. This is particularly useful for eliminating several of them and/or for clearing a path to an exit that would otherwise be blocked by antagonists. There are also a number of temporary or permanent character enhancements or upgrades, such as increased attack power or faster movement, useful for evading or escaping certain enemies that are chasing you, say.
But if you're playing with friends, you have to bear in mind that your friends might not move as fast as you.
The most common items are gold-filled chests, which grant points, as well as food, which adds vitality or hit points. Food intake, however, will never compensate for the constant loss of vitality, even in the absence of enemies. Life points decrease steadily at a rate of 1 point per second most of the time. Add to this the enemies who drain your energy at high speed when they touch you, and you have the perfect cocktail for imminent death.
The purpose of the arcade cabinet, as I mentioned a moment ago, was to earn money in order to be profitable. The only way to stay alive in the long term was to inject coins.
Regarding enemies or antagonists, there isn't a great variety, but they can usually be quite numerous. Most of them emerge from some kind of nest, say, especially when the nest is visible on the screen, and they quickly spread and saturate the play area. You get rid of these enemies by shooting at them, i.e. by holding down the shoot button and pointing in the right direction, or by running into them, except for some. Of course, we should also focus on getting rid of the nests by shooting at them, to restrict or rather stop the proliferation of enemies.
Most of these enemies can be killed with just a few shots.
The most common is the Ghost, which comes in 3 flavors in its arcade version and features 3 different shades of gray. It's the easiest monster to kill, and sometimes it's best just to run into it.
It's important to note that a monster's power depends on the type of nest it emerges from.
Another common enemy is the Grunt, who takes a little longer to kill than the Ghost, but is fairly easy to get rid of, although running into him or it causes more damage to your characters than the Ghost. The Demon, on the other hand, is a little more hostile because it can shoot projectiles in 8 directions. His or its projectiles can kill other monsters, however.
As much as your own projectiles can injure your teammates and destroy food.
An annoying antagonist is the Sorcerer, who can become invisible and move around unnoticed before reappearing. He's not difficult to kill, but still hard to follow, and you can only kill him if he's visible. Another upsetting enemy is the Lobber, who fires projectiles at players from beyond the walls. He's not hard to kill, but as long as he's in the same room or area as we are, and not protected by any wall, of course. Among the few other antagonists, finally, are the Black Spectre, or Death, say, super hard to kill. The green acid puddle, against which we can't do much, and the It, in the sense of tag, you're it. When it touches a player and that there are other players, the monsters are drawn to that specific character until he touches another player, at which point the monsters are drawn to that other character.
If I exclude the Thief from the list of antagonists, there aren't that many enemies.
There's really no need, by the way. A game's interest lies very much in its gameplay. Too many monsters or enemies can be somewhat distracting and don't add much to the game.
Now, regarding the sound aspect of the original game, while not an innovation, it's an interesting feature or gimmick.
Gauntlet II has a musical theme, so to speak, which can be heard not only when the title screen is displayed, but also during gameplay in between levels. Also, as in Gauntlet, the first in the series, there's a sort of narrator or dungeon master who comments on what's happening, a power-up, and undesirable actions such as shooting a projectile at food or imminent death.
So there were a lot of elements to incorporate into the adaptation. Was it going to be a disaster?
Well, no, on the contrary, starting with the title screen. There are fewer colors displayed, but the palette is redefined during vertical blank. And then there's the theme music via the aperiodic noise channel. It's not as good or clear as the one in the original version, regarding sampling quality, that is, but it remains the original tune.
In fact, the SD version of Gauntlet II uses the aperiodic noise channel almost exclusively in order to be as close as possible to the arcade version.
The motherboard of the arcade cabinet was equipped with a Motorola processor similar to that of the ST. The screen resolution was a little higher though, but not by much, 336 by 240 pixels. On the other hand, more colors could be displayed simultaneously, 256 out of 1024. In addition, we had 3 or rather 4 chips dedicated specifically to sound. One advantage was that music and sound effects could be heard simultaneously, but this gimmick wasn't really exploited in the arcade version of Gauntlet II.
The motherboard was similar to that of the Temple of Doom, which I talked about in an earlier episode.
For the ST adaptation, from a visual standpoint, we were limited to a palette of 16 colors out of 512 with a resolution of 320 by 200 pixels, but the developers did their utmost to make the game as similar as possible to the arcade version. Sound-wise, as I said earlier, we've refrained from using the tone channels and used the aperiodic noise channel instead, but it's still remarkable that we've been able to include a majority of the arcade samples, even if it meant cutting back on sound quality.
I was pleasantly surprised when I first played the SD version.
Where compromises had to be made was in the scrolling. Gauntlet II features scrolling in all directions. However, on the original ST, which had no blitter chip, fast horizontal scrolling implied we had to move in chunks of 32 bits for every 8 pixels. This is why scrolling is jerky in some games, such as The Secret of Monkey Island. To achieve a scrolling effect of 4 pixels or less, as in Gauntlet II, you need to prepare the visuals in advance, meaning all offsets, and position them in some area of the screen, in this case on the left, as well as at the top and at the bottom, but in the background. Then we bring everything back to the physical screen. An 8x8 pixel block requires 32 bytes of memory. If we add an offset, just one, we double the memory requirement for that specific offset, i.e. 64 bytes.
But in general, we consider 16 by 16 pixel tiles. Memory requirements are therefore quadrupled, at least.
This means at the very least that 116 by 16 pixel tiles with 4 pixel offsets require 87.5 kilobytes of memory, plus enemy sprites which have up to 4 frames and 8 possible orientations, not to mention their characters' sprites, the heroes, which have the same number.
That would be a third of the usable memory of a 520 ST.
However, you don't need to load everything into memory at once. Visual elements can easily be compressed on a floppy disk and loaded as you go depending on the level you're at. Speaking of levels, Gauntlet II has several dozen to my knowledge, each with different visuals. In fact, at a certain stage, from what I've read, the levels rotate and repeat, but I haven't reached that limit to testify to that.
But what about gameplay and replayability?
As a multiplayer game, it can be fun for a while on a night with friends, for instance, with lots of wine or beer and chips and patience, as the game quickly becomes repetitive and somewhat boring. It's not as if everything is randomly generated, and even if it were the case, you'd soon tire from killing ghosts and demons, collecting keys and searching for the exit from one level to the next. Even the appeal of a high score doesn't make much difference, especially as this score depends on the length of the game, which in turn depends in part on the number of coins you inject into the cabinet in order to stay alive as long as possible.
And by emulation, money is injected by pressing a key on the keyboard.
On the other hand, it's worth highlighting the SD version's exploit of allowing up to 4 players to play at the same time, thanks to an adapter connected to the printer port, whereas the other port on the left side of the computer could have been used, which wasn't exploited much between 1985 and 1993.
So, how's Gauntlet 2's playability and replayability?
Considering that this is an adaptation of an arcade game, it's quite a success, and fans of the original version may well have found it to their liking, as the game remains close to it, even taking into account the limitations of the original ST. Nevertheless, I have to mention one of my favorite games of the time, Mario Bros. In its arcade version. Even in its most difficult setting, with a single coin and 3 lives, I have more fun playing and replaying it than Gauntlet 2, even though the levels and layouts are similar, and that everything happens on cue.
But these are 2 different types of game, I agree. So let's compare Gauntlet 2 with a few siblings.
Similarly, a game I often played when I was younger, either solo or with a friend, was Konami's Devil World or Dark Adventure, released in 1987. I always found Devil World more terrifying because of the antagonists, not to mention the musical score and sound effects. On the ST side, a successor to Gauntlet or even Gauntlet II is Bitmap Brothers' Chaos Engine, released in 1993 at the end of the original ST's life. Visually successful with scrolling in all directions, but no more immersive than Devil World for what little immersion there was.
I'm paraphrasing an article I read in a Computer Gaming World magazine about the DOS version. The game was released too late.
1993 saw the release of Doom, as well as Myst, Shadowrun, and Star Wars X-Wing, games very different from Gauntlet, and which illustrated the trend of the time, especially in the case of Doom, which for me remains a must-have.
Also, in the western part of the world, arcades went into gradual decline between 1985 and 1993.
Even if arcades still existed in the early 1990s, the flavor of the day was Mortal Kombat, a combat game played competitively rather than in collaboration or cooperation. That said, we attempted a sequel to Gauntlet towards the end of the 1990s, both for arcades and for the consoles of the time, such as the original PlayStation, the Sega Dreamcast, and the Nintendo 64, with a bird's eye view slightly tilted.
I said a sequel, but in fact there have been a few which are really rehashes of the original concept but adapted to the trends and/or technologies of the time.
Of questionable or debatable interest, an example is Gauntlet III, with a diametric view because it was trendy at the time. The ludicrous aspect of an army of monsters against a single hero is barely balanced out when you're alone, and the concept remains the same. Even Seven Sorrows is still hack and slash with few RPG elements. The objective remains to annihilate armies of monsters, collect treasures, unearth items, open doors by activating mechanisms, and find your way out. It's a button masher first and foremost.
And from what I read, the reviews were mixed. IGN and GameSpot, to name but these 2, have almost opposite views.
In other words, Gauntlet II, like its predecessor, is a game for those who want to play in collaboration with other players without having to rack their brains regarding what to achieve or how to reach the game's objective. Despite its fantasy/medieval theme, this is a far cry from traditional RPGs in which the ultimate quest or endeavor or goal implies having characters growing or evolving over weeks, even months.
And I'll spare you the various adaptations for computers and consoles, with one exception.
Regarding Gauntlet, the first of the series, a very acceptable conversion is that for the Genesis/Mega Drive, very close to the arcade version, but with a musical ambiance in addition to the sound effects. The fact remains that it's still rooted in a somewhat dated type of game, and it's because there were fans of the genre that the game sold, at least I think so.
Because I'm aware that despite the qualities of the ST adaptation, because it's the ST version I'm addressing today, the game proves somewhat redundant. Could it have been done better?
At the risk of departing from the ST conversion of the game, I would have added either a level editor or a random level generator, along with an endless mode in which the goal would have been to stay alive as long as possible and reach the highest possible score. Otherwise, I have no complaints about the ST conversion of Gauntlet II. It's well done and does justice to the original arcade version, which wasn't always the case with other conversions.
This was today's episode. As always, thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support me, it's easy and the link is in the description. Also, like, subscribe, share, and don't hesitate to let me know in the comments your impressions regarding Gauntlet 2. Which version or conversion do you prefer and why? If the game had to be improved, what would you have added or changed? Also, if there are any games you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. I'm Guy from The Other Day. See you soon.